How many times have you set goals but not achieved them? Most people don't fail because their goals are too big. They fail because the first step is too big. Big goals fail because nobody teaches us how to design tiny experiments that create huge progress. So today we're going to show you how to make 2026 the best year of your life. And there's no better person to learn from than Anne-Laure Cunff. She's an award-winning neuroscientist, founder of Ness Labs with over 130,000 subscribers, and author of Tiny Experiments, the book that's redefining how we think about goals, progress, and identity. In this conversation, we're going to break down the real problem with goals, why we are drunk on the illusion of certainty, and how tiny experiments can finally get you unstuck. But first, what is the problem with goals? Because it's not what you think it is.
So first, what is a goal? A goal is when you have a very specific outcome, a destination in mind, and you say, if I reach that destination, this is success. And if I don't reach that destination, this is failure. So it's a very binary definition of success. There are lots of problems with goals in that traditional sense of the term. The first one is that when you're obsessed with being successful in that very, very binary sense of the way, you might try as much as possible to avoid failure. And we know there's a lot of research that failure is actually one of the best ways to learn and grow. So when you avoid failure, you feel like you're being successful, but you're actually stagnating. That's number one. The second one is that if you see goals and success in that very linear way, where you're supposed to reach the next milestone in a specific order, and again, you're at point A, you want to get to point B, then it makes it very tempting to compare yourself to others, to compare your success to the one of others. It's almost as if everybody was like climbing their own ladder and you keep on looking right and left and asking yourself, oh, who's climbing faster? And why is this friend I was in school with already up there and I'm still stuck down there? So it creates this very unhealthy social comparison. And lastly, it really prevents you from, or at least it limits your curiosity. If you're already focused in that linear ambition of climbing the ladder as quickly as possible, getting to that destination at all costs and not failing, you might not try new things just for the sake of it. Explore a new skill, a new domain, or something, a new topic that you're interested in. Because if all of those things don't seem to contribute to you being as effective and productive as possible and getting to your goal, then they might feel like distractions.
The tension that just came to mind as I was listening was the balance between focus and, I mean, I've listened to a number of Steve Jobs videos being like Steve Jobs is the most focused person on the planet, and that produced incredible outcomes, I suppose. But what I'm maybe figuring out now is that he wasn't focused on the outcome, he was focused on the process. Is that how they tie together, or is there a different way of thinking about the tension between focus and curiosity?
That's so interesting because I don't think that was the case for Steve Jobs. I think he was very focused on the outcome. There's a reason why he's been described as a visionary. He had a vision. And I argue in the book that linear goals can actually be helpful in very narrow situations where you actually know exactly where you want to go and you need to do it. But those situations are so rare. And Steve Jobs is also not everyone.
What?
Yeah. And I find it really interesting. There's this entire culture around people who are obviously a bit different from everyone else in the sense that they're completely obsessed, right? And we don't even need to get into those details, but we also know that in his personal life, he was not such a great human being, right? So what was he sacrificing in this obsession for this very linear definition of success? So I'm really glad you used that example because to me, it shows that linear goals can work. They can actually work. I'm not saying they don't work, but they work in very limited situations. And also they usually work at the cost of lots of other areas of your life. And I personally don't think that being the next Steve Jobs is a very productive way to think about your life. That's very unlikely to happen. And I also think that in this very narrow definition of ambition is not useful in the sense that, to me, being a good parent, a good friend, maybe a great cook, or a great, all of that, that's ambition too. And we should have room for that. And linear goals leave no room for that.
So can we double click on where you believe linear goals are suitable? In what settings, where in our lives?
If you know exactly what you're supposed to do and you just need to do it, then linear goals or the old framework of SMART goals, this is completely fine. It's literally about saying, this is what we're going to do. This is how we're going to measure success. Those are our binary definition of getting there or not getting there. And now let's do it, right? I recently had a compliance meeting. Nobody likes compliance meetings, right?
I can see in your face that you loved that meeting.
We were basically trying to figure out how to make part of our website compliant with GDPR stuff, like boring stuff, right? No room for experimentation here. We had very clear KPIs checklist of things that need to get done. These things need to get done, and that's it. And so you need linear goals, and you give them to your team, and you say, hey, you really need to get that thing done by the end of the month. Because if not, we're going to get fined. So that's it. And that's a linear goal, is, and you do it, right? In parts of your life or work where there is a lot of uncertainty, you actually don't really know what success looks like. You've never done it before, or it's never been done before, or your team hasn't done it before. I argue that those linear goals only give you the illusion of control and the illusion of certainty. And that instead of trying to say, here's the goal, here's the destination, you should experiment instead. And you should say, okay, we've never done this before. What can we try? And then whatever the outcome, we will learn from this outcome. And we will use that new knowledge, which we didn't have when we got started, to design our next experiment. And I argue that if you do that, you will grow. You will grow. It's just that you don't know what it's going to look like. And I think that's better, because that's real growth to me. Being able to look back and feel like, wow, I had no idea. And there was no way I could have imagined that this would be where we would end up, because I actually didn't even know it was possible to get there in the first place.
The challenge I have is that maybe this is the same as lots of ambitious people, but I am great at building certainty about a potential goal and going, that's the thing, I want that thing, and not questioning where that certainty has come from. And often that certainty has come from a place of fear, anxiety, a place of scarcity, something that feels like not right inside me. And so therefore I'll set this big ambitious goal and that will fix something. All this is all like subconscious I'm talking about. It's not like in my rational mind, like I'm afraid of being irrelevant, therefore I'm going to build a massive company and become relevant. But on our subconscious level, that's how lots of people craft these big goals. So how do you take time in questioning where certainty comes from?
Yeah, this is really about, and this is something I talk about a lot in my work. It's a practice that I think should be taught in school and isn't, which is metacognition. And metacognition means thinking about thinking. It's the ability to observe your own thoughts, your own feelings, but not just that. It's not just introspection. Metacognition is the ability to question those thoughts and feelings, to ask yourself, why am I thinking this thought? Where is this thought coming from? Do I want to have this thought? Do I want to change this thought? What would a different thought look like? And so making space to practice metacognition is one of the best ways to consider whether the goals you have in your life and your ambitions in general are things you actually truly care about, or things that, as you said, come from a place of fear, or could be just copy pasted from other people around you sometimes. Sometimes it's not fear. It's really just that it's more like mimetic desire, where you just feel like, because everybody around me wants this thing, surely I should want this thing as well. At a very practical level, that really looks like carving out time in your life for going inwards. And I actually know this is a lot more difficult than it sounds. Saying it is easy, but life gets busy. And also sometimes we feel really uncomfortable looking inwards. And so we'll find a lot of different ways to keep busy, distract ourselves. But this is the best investment you can make in yourself. It can look like 10 minutes in the morning, an hour every Sunday. And even the modality can be very different. And I hate being prescriptive with those things, because I know that what works for me might not work for another person. And that's why I tell people to experiment with different modalities. But journaling works for a lot of people. Meditating can help. Or sometimes the insights don't come during the meditation. They can come afterwards, but it really helps you stay open. For people who don't like to write or meditate, just having a regular coffee catch up with your best friend and making it explicitly about checking in. How did you spend your time this week? Is that how you wanted to spend your time? How did that feel? Do you want to spend your time in the same way next week, or what would you change? And having those conversations. All of these are metacognitive practices.
Therapy, coaching.
Yes.
Professionals doing this for you. How do you do it? What is your metacognitive practice?
I journal every day. And it's the first thing I do in the morning. I make myself a cup of coffee and I journal.
Is this plus minus next? Or is it different?
That's separate. The journaling is very free flow. And I do it in a notebook, analog. I have a really nice fountain pen that comes from Brittany, where my dad is from, in France, made with olive tree wood I love. So I make it like more like a ritual.
Wow.
And it's also part of an effort I'm trying to make to not touch my phone in the first half hour during the day. The plus minus next is something I use as a weekly review, and that I do on my computer. And I have a very simple document, and it has 3 columns, plus, minus, next. And in the first column, plus, I write a few bullet points about everything that went well the past week. In the second column, things that didn't go so well. And in the last column, what I want to tweak or experiment with the following week. And the reason why I do it digitally and rather and not on a notebook is that I also find it really helpful to reflect back and to look at patterns. And the document is actually in Google Slides. So it's one slide, which I just duplicate every week with the columns. And so it's plus minus next for this week. And then I duplicate it for the next week and I fill it plus minus next. And so I have this like hundreds of slides that are just plus minus next for each week, which means I can export it as a PDF. I can put it in AI. I can flip through it very easily. When I do my annual review at the end of the year, which is also another ritual that I have, I can just go back through the past weeks from the year. It makes it so much easier. Whereas my daily journaling is more about getting out whatever needs to be expressed in that moment. I don't spend really any time reading back on those entries.
So interesting. I've been doing your end of year review for years.
Oh, amazing.
I love it. And I've shared it with lots of people. So it's brilliant. I'll put a link in the description for your annual review template. And I turned it into a Notion page as well.
Oh,
so
great.
Now I do it on Notion.
Yes.
I have been doing therapy for years, for almost a decade now, and coaching. And I have we've been doing couples therapy, which has been amazing as well. And our couples therapist called me out recently on over intellectualizing my feelings, which stops me from actually feeling the feelings, which I don't know if you can relate to as an academic, is being very neck up. How have you made sure that you are feeling feelings fully, and if you even like want to, and like what's your perception around feelings?
It's actually a topic that comes back a lot in the Ness Labs community because we're all a bunch of nerds, and there are so many wonderful qualities in being a nerd. But one of the common challenges is what you just described of, just anything above the neck, being in your head and not really connecting with any of the feelings, not connecting with your body. For me, what it looks like to try and feel more connected to myself beyond the mental / cognitive level is moving my body. So mindful movement. I love dancing, and I try to incorporate it in my daily life in a way that's not formal. So something I'll do very often is that in the middle of working, I can be in front of my computer in the middle of writing a newsletter or writing a research paper. And if I notice that, and again, it's my body telling me, usually it's not my mind, that I'm like this, when you're on your keyboard and you're all tense.
Closed.
Yes. Yeah. I'm really practicing noticing that this is happening, because this is usually a sign of stress and anxiety. And again, trying to be in control and typing as fast as possible. I will get up and I will put some music on and I will dance for a couple of minutes in my living room, like no one's watching. And then I'll get back to work and I instantly feel better. I also go to ecstatic dance at least once a week, sometimes twice a week, which is, for people who are not familiar with what it is, it's a form of free flow dancing, which follows what they call an ecstatic wave. You start very quiet at the beginning, very calm. Most people stretch at that point. You can do some breath work, and then it becomes more and more energetic and intense until you get to the top of the wave, and then it goes back to slow and calm and quiet. And every time I go, I sleep like a baby afterwards. It's amazing. You see a lot of people, which has happened to me as well, lots of people who end up crying, having an emotional release. And the reason why it works so well is because you stop thinking, overthinking, analyzing your own thoughts. You're fully in your body during that experience. So those are some of the practices that help. I also like taking long walks, going on hikes, and they're great. But because I live in the city, they're not as accessible to me. And walking around East London sometimes creates more stress than it's not particularly relaxing. So moving my body.
The thing that this reminded me of is in one of the biggest takeaways from my somatic therapy journey, of which somatic therapy is how we store stress and trauma in our bodies, and that causes pain, but also it blocks energy flow for our bodies. And one of the best practices has been asking my body questions and understanding what my body's response is to a yes or a no, or even a non-answer, which either means I'm asking the wrong question or it's the wrong time. And so when you said like you felt like you were closing up in with your laptop when your body was like tense, that's how my body says no. And so when I ask a question like, oh, the priority for me is to work with this person, my body just starts like closing up if it's a no, or it opens up if it's a yes. And so that's so interesting. That's been a massive thing when I don't feel like I know the answer or couldn't figure it out, it's too complex, get out of the conscious mind and get into the subconscious, which can store so much more information, which my somatic therapist says can look round corners, like it has the potential to look into the future. She speaks about quantum energy, and that kind of goes past my understanding.
I think this kind of self-curiosity can be extremely powerful when you approach whatever, if it's a knot in your stomach or whatever it is, instead of trying to get rid of it, control it, force yourself to feel better, to just have this little conversation with yourself, conversation with your body, conversation with your emotions. I find it extremely powerful. And I haven't done this exercise you describe of asking particular parts of my body, but I know that whenever I feel anxious, for example, I try to make it a bit more playful by being like, oh, hi, welcome back. You're here. What are you trying to tell me? And instead of, blaming myself for being anxious or seeing it as this pesky, annoying emotion I should not be feeling, really almost considering it as a guest that I maybe didn't invite right now, but they're here. They're in the living room. I'm not going to be rude. So, making them some tea, sitting down and having a conversation. I find that way of thinking about my emotions very helpful as well.
Having a very direct conversation. Hi, why are you here? What are you doing here? I didn't invite you, but you're here now.
Yes.
Are you staying for dinner? I'd rather if you didn't stay for dinner. Okay. I love that. I feel like tying it back, one of the things which take us away from this curiosity are these cognitive scripts that you speak out in the book. Can you describe what a cognitive script is? Quick pause to say that I would love for you to subscribe for two reasons. One is if you subscribe, it helps the business, my business, the podcast, which then means that I get bigger guests, which then hopefully means that you get more value because they're more interesting conversations, if you like how I have conversations. The second reason is that if you subscribe, then you're not going to miss the incredible conversations that are going to come up in the near future. So hit a subscribe button. It helps us both.
So the research about cognitive scripts started in the late 70s. And the way they started exploring this was by asking people, if I put you in a certain situation, how do you behave? What do you do? What are the actions you take? And what they found is that if you put people in a similar situation, they all behave in very similar ways. And it can be really helpful when you think about certain social situations. So for example, if you go to the restaurant, you know that you're supposed to wait at the front and then there's a staff member is going to come and ask you, how many of you? Just wait a second, here's your table, you sit down, they give you a menu and then you order your food, right? Your parents never taught you that. Nobody told you that that's what you're supposed to do and those are the steps you're supposed to follow in that exact order. But you've seen enough people do it that you've integrated that script. That's the script for being just acting normal at the restaurant. And it's very helpful to have those cognitive scripts in our daily lives, right? Like that's why when you go to the doctor, you wait in the waiting room and then the doctor comes and see you and ask you to come in their office. If they walked out of the office and asked you to get undressed in front of everybody in the waiting room, it would feel quite weird because they're going off script. So cognitive scripts, useful, we all have them, and they help us function as a society. The problem is we also follow a lot of cognitive scripts in other areas of our lives where maybe we don't want to go for the automated behavior. We don't want to go for the blueprint, the recipe that you're supposed to follow in that particular situation. And we don't realize it, but that's what we're doing. And so in the book, I try to think about all of those cognitive scripts in terms of 3 big buckets, 3 types of cognitive scripts that might impact the decisions that we make in our lives in ways that we might not want them to. The first script is the sequel script. This is the script we follow when we believe that whatever decision we make today needs to be aligned with the decisions we made in the past. So it needs to have this nice narrative continuity. And this is the script we follow when let's say you're a student and you graduate from university and you're only going to apply for jobs that align with whatever you studied at university. This is the job I see, this is the script I see a lot of entrepreneurs also following where they feel like their next business or startup needs to make sense based on what they worked on before. And we limit ourselves in that way when we follow the sequel script. The second one is the Crowdpleaser script, pretty self-descriptive. It's the script we follow when we make decisions based on what we think is going to please people around us, whether that's our friends, family, colleagues. And this one is very common when you see people go for the kind of like the cooler job or being a doctor or lawyer because it's going to please their parents. And so really going for whatever people around you is going to say, this is great. You're doing great. You're successful. Good job. And the last one, I think, is the most insidious one because we celebrate it as a society. I call it the epic script, inspired by Hollywood movies. And this is when we make decisions based on this idea that whatever you do in life, it needs to be big, impressive. It needs to be your passion. You need to wake up every morning feeling like you're changing the world. And anything less than that is failure. And that one is particularly dangerous because you limit yourself in terms of trying to find that one big passion, which means you're not exploring other things you might be curious about. But also, you might feel miserable because you look around you and you feel like all of these people have found their passion and you haven't yet. So maybe your life doesn't have as much meaning, which impacts your self-worth.
Yeah, you describe this in the book as the tyranny of purpose.
Yes.
Which I love. It's a great phrase. Because you're right, everyone speaks about like find your purpose, start with why, all of these things, right? Which of these scripts did you find yourself most victim to or attached to?
Absolutely all of them.
All of them?
I've experienced all of them. All of them. And I think most people actually, there might be, yes, a dominant one, but most people will experience all of them. If I had to pick really one of them, it would be probably the Crowdpleaser script for me. I know that I made a lot of decisions early in my career based on what would make my parents, and in particular my mom, feel like I was going to be safe. I had a good job. I was making good money. I could put food on the table, have a roof on my head, and she could relax now. And I find the Crowdpleaser script really hard to break free from because it really stems from loving the people who matter to you in your life and wanting them to be happy. But then you end up making decisions about your life that you're not maybe too happy about, but you make their happiness the priority.
The ultimate challenge of like short-term decisions or prioritizing the short term over the long term, when in the short term she feels safe and secure, but in the long term you live an unfulfilling career and you feel less than. And ultimately, the ultimate goal that she wants for you in the long term is your happiness and fulfillment.
Yeah, and that's the interesting part. The interesting aspect of the Crowdpleaser script is that it is really based on what you think will make other people happy. And sometimes what you think will make them happy is actually wrong, right? You think it will make your father or your mother happy that you're a doctor or a lawyer, when in reality, what will make them happy, as you said, is to see you fulfilled and to see you happy to wake up in the morning. That's what they want ultimately, not for you to be a doctor or a lawyer.
Which scripts do you think, actually, I already know the answer to this question, feels like the epic script is the one that entrepreneurs get sucked into most? Go and raise a big round of funding, go and change the world, go and be the next Steve Jobs.
No, absolutely. And in that process, a lot of them tend to tie their entire identity into the job. And this is also something I mentioned in the book, how this can have terrible consequences on your mental health when you put all of your eggs in the same basket, which is very common with startup founders, just entrepreneurs in general. And when you drop that basket, when the startup fails, which is very common also, you see a lot of cases of founders really struggling with their mental health after the startup fails, because all of a sudden they feel like, who am I? Am I even worth anything? What am I going to tell people? And what is the purpose of my entire life if this one thing I believed was going to change the world didn't work out?
It's so funny. I went for a walk this morning with a good friend of mine and we spoke about how you almost feel guilty when everything isn't about work. You almost feel guilty that conversation with your partner aren't about work. Even things like this, and how it's crazy how much of an impact the narrative of startups, how big that impact has been. And I also think about, I listened to a podcast called Founders, where this guy reads out the autobiographies of some of history's greatest entrepreneurs. And he repeatedly speaks about the obsession that all of these founders have. And he is classic part of society, highlighting this epic script of being like, if you are absolutely obsessed and you give your entire life to this thing, then like you change the world and you build this massive company. And so I feel like it's such a difficult one to break free of. Do you have any role models of people of entrepreneurs that you look up to that maybe have broken away from this script?
I have a few friends actually who are doing a pretty good job at maintaining a very healthy relationship with their work. A book I very often recommend people read as a companion book to Tiny Experiments.
After you finish this and gifted it to a friend, then you can buy the next one.
I mean, not even necessarily in the sense that this friend actually recommends my book very often also. So, and we're actually literally yesterday we were talking about maybe creating a bundle together. So
Cool.
The book is called The Pathless Path by Paul Millard. And my book is more science-based, practical, with tools and frameworks, whereas his book is more of a mini memoir of how he left what he calls the default path, which I tend to call the linear path, to now just explore and really follow his curiosity. He started in consulting. I can't remember which of the big consulting companies it was, maybe McKinsey or BCG, very successful, making really good money. And now he's just traveling the world. He has a beautiful wife and kid. He's hosting events, building a community, writing a newsletter. He turned down a huge book deal from Penguin because he wanted to keep his creative freedom. And just recently, I love how he posted a screenshot of someone who emailed him and said, I'm creating a group of high net worth individuals. Do you want to join? And he posted a screenshot of the email on Twitter and said, who wants to start a group of low net worth individuals with me? Because he's really trying to not optimize for any of the traditional measures of success. And so for him, success is being able to spend as much time as possible with his kid while his kid is so young, is to be able to make creative choices. So he just redesigned a new version of his book that is absolutely gorgeous, but where each copy, I can't remember, I think it's like $100 for the book. A traditional publisher would never do that. It makes no sense. And I think he sold hundreds already because people actually love a really beautiful book. And so that's one example of someone that I think is really doing well and having an experimental mindset in his own way. And yeah, do you read his book after you've read mine?
The Pathless Path. I've read yours, so it's next on the list. The area I'd like to go into next is kind of, we touched on it at the start, but it's around certainty and uncertainty, and ultimately control. I've been listening to a lot of Michael Singer, the Surrender Experiments, and just generally as a huge advocate for letting go, which for very type A, ambitious, linear goal obsessed entrepreneurs, that was a complete flip of my world. And so what have you learnt, or where are founders most drunk on this illusion of certainty?
Before I answer your question, I just want to take the opportunity. It's very unlikely that he would listen to this episode, but I want to thank Michael Singer because
we'll send it to him. We'll get Michael listening.
I discovered his work a few years ago, and it's thanks to him I can sleep on planes now, because I was reading his book on a plane and I thought, what would it look like to not try to fall asleep? Because every time I'm like, fall asleep, and it's not happening. What would it look like if I just closed my eyes and sat here and relaxed? And I fell asleep. And now that's what I do when I'm on the plane, and I can sleep on planes now thanks to him. So thank you, Michael. In terms of when founders get drunk on this idea, a lot of it comes down to planning where I see time and time again founders around me or people in the Ness Labs community trying to craft those beautiful plans and having this big vision. And then whenever something happens that doesn't fit the plan, they panic as if something was wrong, when there's nothing wrong because the plan is completely artificial. And so that tension is in between reality and something you created in your mind that has very often no basis in reality. What I think is a lot more fruitful, instead of having this illusion of control, this illusion of certainty that then creates anxiety and fear, is to actually embrace uncertainty. And I find it useful to think about it a little bit like a scientist. So when a scientist designs an experiment and the result they get an unexpected result, they don't panic and feel like something is really wrong and they need to fix it so they can get the result they wanted. No, they get excited, actually. They feel like, oh, that's new. I didn't see that one coming. What can we learn from this? This mindset, really shifting from control to curiosity when you're in a space of uncertainty, I think can make all the difference in your experience when you're growing as a founder. Because instead of always clinging to this plan that you have and this vision and feeling terrible every time it doesn't unfold in the way you want it to, then building your company becomes more like a playground, a laboratory, a sandbox, where you can experiment, try new things, and grow and figuring it out as you go.
Hey, me again. I would love to hear what you think about this conversation in the comments. I read and respond to every single comment, and so I would love to have a conversation with you. So drop a comment. What's interesting? What questions come up for you? What don't you like? What do you like? And we can have another conversation there, just you and me. All right? All right, back to the episode. I love that. And so many incredible companies have been built as the spin-off to the original plan. Slack is a great example of this. However, I suppose the challenge is, even if a founder is able to lean into the uncertainty, you are leading others and you are accountable to investors, various people who may not be as comfortable leaning into uncertainty. So how do you manage the relationship both up and down?
It is actually the main challenge, because when you're a leader, you feel like people look up to you for answers and you need to look like you know where you're going. And I think actually that it's the wrong thing to focus on. And we've seen also a lot of startups fail or struggle because the founder was too focused on communicating or projecting an image of success rather than actually embracing the messiness of the process of growing a business. So I would say the first step is to kind of decouple your actual work building the startups from the communication around it. And yes, you need to manage stakeholders. You need to tell them, you need to communicate around the startup and all of that. That can be a separate thing from actually defining the priorities and the work that you do. And a misconception a lot of people have when I talk about being more experimental is that people think I'm saying just experiment with everything, try new things, see what sticks. And that's not what I'm saying. Experimentation can actually provide amazing scaffolding for growth, and it can also give you the tools and the language to communicate with others. So you're not saying, oh, we're just kind of like figuring it out. We have no idea, right? No, you're saying, okay, these are the 3 areas of uncertainty that we have identified where we're not quite sure because maybe new competitors, maybe new technology, maybe geopolitical, kind of events that are kind of changing the context in the way we don't quite understand. First, you're demonstrating that you understand the context and your environment in which you're building your product. Great. Second, to kind of understand what's going on here and see what we're going to do next. Here are 3 experiments we're going to run, and we are going to see what happens. And then I'm going to report back, and I'm going to tell you what worked and what didn't. And based on that, we're going to make decisions on what the next experiment is supposed to look like. You don't sound like you don't know what you're doing, right? You just sound like someone who is very realistically appraising the situation, embracing the fact that there is a lot of uncertainty, and demonstrating leadership. The last part, which I think is incredibly important, is that you should not be the one, if you're in a position of leadership, ideally you should not be the one coming up with the experiments themselves. You should be the one coming up with maybe a couple of, a hypothesis as to maybe what's going on. You should be the one creating space for experimentation, telling people, hey, we're going to experiment. But ideally, what you want is to inspire the people you work with to come and suggest experiments that they think might help reduce that uncertainty or navigate it better. And when you have all of that together, when you know that your marketing, your communication is a separate thing, and that the work itself should be decoupled from that. When you communicate upwards by saying, we're not quite sure what's going on here, but here's how we're going to figure it out. And when when with your team, you encourage them to contribute to that process instead of being the one just leading them, then you can navigate uncertainty effectively. And again, you can really demonstrate what I think true leadership is all about.
So we've got uncertainty in companies. Founders are managing them from an expectations perspective, but then you have what you've called liminal moments. Can you explain what a liminal moment is?
The title of the book actually used to be Liminal Minds, Not Tiny Experiments. And we changed it because nobody knew what liminal meant, which I can't blame them for because I actually didn't know what that word meant before I started doing research for this book. So liminal comes from the Latin word limen, which means the in-between, the threshold, the doorstep of something new, the doorstep of change. A liminal moment is when you are in between phases in your life, in between moments. You're in a transition. So for example, a very common one is you graduated, but you haven't started your first job yet. Or your previous startup failed, you haven't started a new one yet. In your personal life, maybe you're engaged but not married yet. Those are all liminal spaces. And our instinctive response when we find ourselves in a liminal space is to try and get out of there as quickly as possible, because liminal spaces are uncertain. You don't know what the rules are. Sometimes you don't even know who you are. The self of identity is unclear. And so we want to go back to certainty as quickly as possible. And I argue in the book that we could benefit a lot from seeing liminal spaces as an opportunity for growth and an opportunity for self-discovery. And that if we learn to sit in the uncertainty, we can learn a lot about what we actually want and who we want to be.
What was the most uncomfortable liminal space that you've sat in?
So many of them. I'm going to share one that is probably going to be relevant for entrepreneurs. It was when I quit my job at Google, and I was so uncomfortable with having lost this very clear identity that I had before. When people ask me, what do you do? I work at Google. Oh, that's so cool. You must be so smart. Such an amazing company to work for. All of a sudden, I didn't have that anymore. And I was so uncomfortable with not knowing my next steps, not having a plan, not having a vision for my life, that I jumped straight into building a startup. Not because there was something I actually wanted to build or because I was actually, coming from a place of wanting to contribute something that was going to have a positive impact, although that was a part of it. But really, if I'm honest with myself, at the core, the reason why I started a startup at the time was because I wanted to get out of that liminal space. And I wanted to go back to knowing who I was, what my work identity was, what I was contributing to the world, why I was here and why I was waking up in the morning. And building a startup, being in the Silicon Valley environment I was in at the time, was the most obvious next step at the time to escape that liminal space.
So interesting. Lots of the questions that you asked were like the tyranny of purpose. Comes back to what society is pushing us, these questions that we should be answering. Okay. And that then led you to this tiny experiment of writing, publishing every week. And that was the birth of Ness Labs.
Yeah. So fortunately for me, my startup failed, which meant that for the very first time in my life, I admitted to myself that I had no idea what I wanted to do, that I had no plan, that I didn't have a vision. And I thought this would be terrifying, but it was actually the most freeing thought I ever experienced. And so instead of jumping straight into the next thing, I did spend a little bit of time this time around asking myself, okay, so if the traditional definition of success was, if I just forget about it, if success was out of the equation, if no one was watching, what is something I'm so curious about that I would be very excited to just wake up in the morning and explore, even if nobody was watching and even if money was not part of it? And for me, it was the brain. I had always been curious about why we think the way we think and feel the way we feel. So I went back to school in my late 20s to study neuroscience, not with a goal in mind, just because I was really curious about it. And while I was back in university to do this little neuroscience program, I learned about a psychological effect called the generation effect, which shows that when you create your own version of something, and that can be writing, that can be creating a video or a podcast like we're doing right now. When you create your own version of something, you will both understand it and remember it better. And I thought that was pretty neat. So I decided to start a tiny experiment where I said, I will write one short article every day for the next 100 days. And they could be very, very short. They just had to be about something I learned in university about neuroscience. And another rule I had is that I could not hide behind jargon. It had to be very easy to understand because that's how I could prove to myself that I actually understood what I was writing about. This newsletter was the beginning of Ness Labs, which since then has become a community, has become a business, and has become an amazing platform for me to explore and share ideas.
And how many readers are you currently boasting, and how is it going?
I think almost 130,000, something like that. Yeah.
Wow.
I'm posting every Thursday still, every week. And it's still one of my favorite moments every week to sit down, make myself my cup of coffee, second cup of coffee after journaling for Thursdays, and start writing the newsletter every week. I absolutely love it. We also have a private community with 2,000 members, where there's a space where people can design their own tiny experiments and support each other as if they had a little lab that they were sharing together. It is a business, but it rarely feels like work.
The dream. Wow. So you got here because of a tiny experiment. So can you explain what is a tiny experiment and why should we use them?
At a very practical level, a tiny experiment is when you say that you will commit to exploring a specific action for a specific duration. I think it's helpful to think about tiny experiments in contrast with habits and goals, which are usually the kind of frameworks that we use in personal and professional development. When you have a habit, you say, I'm going to do this thing for the rest of my life. Which is kind of crazy when you think about it, because sometimes you've never done that thing before and all of a sudden you commit to it for the rest of your life. With a tiny experiment, you say, I'm going to try this thing for this duration, and then we'll see. We'll see what I learn. We'll see if I like it or not and whether I want to keep going. So you're not assuming that this is going to be good. You're not assuming that this is going to help. You might have a hypothesis, but it's a bit more like a research question. What might happen if I try this thing? Let's collect data for that duration. The difference with a goal is that with a goal, you have a very, again, binary definition of success. You have a certain outcome in mind that you want to get to. Whereas with a tiny experiment, you have no idea, again, what success might look like. It might be a complete failure in the traditional sense of the term when you run your tiny experiment. But if you approach it like a scientist, now you know it's great. You had never done it before. Now you've done it and you know it doesn't work. Great. That is growth. That is actual growth. So that's what a tiny experiment is all about. And so to just give you a few examples, action and duration, right? Always action and duration. You could say, I will reach out to one expert every day for 2 weeks. Action and duration. It can be in your more personal life. I will meditate every morning for a month. I will, if you want to try mine, I will journal every day for a month. I will meal prep on Sundays for 4 weeks. I will action for duration. And the last part that's so important is that you withhold judgment for that entire duration. You're just collecting data, just like a scientist that doesn't start poking at the data in the middle and feel like, oh, I don't like what I'm seeing. I'm just going to stop. You just finish the experiment. You collect your data for the duration, which is why it's good to keep them tiny. And then at the end, then only at the end, you look back, you analyze the results, and you decide what you might want to do next.
Hi, so lots of value in this. I have distilled all this value into a Google Doc, which helps you refine everything that's in her book and everything that's in this conversation. That is in the description. If you click on that link, you'll get a bunch more value and make these learning experiences that much easier. Cool, back to the episode. It feels like one of the biggest difference between tiny experiments and habit creation or big goals is the identity piece. Habits are a result of us believing that we have become a future version of ourselves. I am the type of person who exercises 4 or 5 times a week, therefore I am a healthy person. Or I meditate every day, therefore I am calm and grounded. And it feels like the main identifying characteristic here is I am curious. I'm not assuming I know what the outcome is going to be. I'm just curious to be the scientist and conduct this experiment.
Oh, this is such a great way to put it. Yes, absolutely. And there's also, there's a lot of research first for the identity piece. Yeah, there's a lot of research for habits that it's actually really helpful to think about it in terms of identity. I know that when I read Atomic Habits and I read that identity piece, I felt like, oh, that's exactly how I managed to quit smoking at the time. It's when I finally started telling people, oh, I don't smoke. I'm not a smoker, versus what I used to do, which was I'm trying to quit, which didn't work. And you're right that with tiny experiments, that's the identity piece. I'm curious. And whatever the outcome, I'm going to be curious about that result. And I'm going to keep on practicing curiosity through experimentation.
So I'm curious, as given that we're coming near the end of this year, most people classically set goals near the end of the year and try and have a big vision for their upcoming year. What is your process? How do you think about end of year? And do you set any goals? Do you set tiny experiments? How often do you set them? How does that look?
Yeah, I've been very, very vocally against New Year resolutions for years. I've written about that and about how I find them completely counterproductive. So I don't have goals in that sense. However, I do think that the end of the year is actually an amazing liminal space. It's a time of transition, and it can be very generative in terms of insights if you actually take the time to slow down and practice metacognition. So every year I do an annual review. It's been a ritual for years, and I actually host a little version of that, more like workshopy version of that in the Ness Labs community with others. And I also do a longer version myself on my own, where I take whatever I wrote in that workshop and I expand on it and I go deeper. It's amazing how every year I think I know how my year went, but it's only when I sit down and I actually reflect on the experience that I can actually take stock of everything that happened and of how much I've changed also in the past 12 months. And this is out of all of the rituals that I have in my life, I think this is one of the most important ones. And then I don't set goals for the following year, but I start thinking about potential experiments that I could run to address some of the challenges, the points of friction, or areas of curiosity that I might have from that past year. And I don't always conduct all of these experiments, and it's not set in stone, it's not fixed. It's more as a starting point for me to start the year. And then usually, and not usually, every time, and I think everybody can relate with that, things start happening during the next year, I keep on changing. And so usually by March, whatever experiments I had in mind in December make no sense. And so I'll just design something different. So that's why I don't like having too much of a long-term plan for the year. There are always new opportunities, new people I meet, things that I couldn't have predicted that will impact what I'm curious about and I might want to explore.
How do you feel about persistence, about consistency and compound gains over a long period of time? There are periods where it's really tough and it's easier to stop whatever we're doing. How does that come into your process of progressing?
I think being persistent, or rather being consistent, is important. I wrote about what I call flexible consistency, which is really the idea that if you want to be consistent over the long term, you need to be flexible in the short term. It is actually quite similar to how James Clear talks about habits, right? Where you can miss one day, but try to not miss 2 days. And so I think it's helpful to think about that. If there's any kind of work that you care about, that it's important to think about it in this way. Long-term, being consistent. Short-term, being flexible. The reason why I hesitated when I said persistent is that I don't think it can work if you're only relying on discipline and willpower in order to be consistent. And so to me, when I think about the word persistent, there's almost an idea of being strong and resilient, and you have to keep on showing up even when it's hard. I think being consistent only works, and you can be consistent if you have a bit more of a flexible approach. And again, metacognition, which I can't shut up about, but noticing when it feels hard and not assuming, like lots of people will tell you online, that you just need to push through. You just need to be strong. Instead, being curious about why is it so hard right now? What's going on? Is it a problem with the project itself? Is it a problem with how you feel? Sometimes, I struggle with a project and I just realized that I'm like in front of my computer. I can't figure it out. I just realized that I hadn't had a glass of water in 6 hours, or maybe I'm just a little bit tired. Sometimes it can be as easy as that, but you only notice if you pay attention. But sometimes if it's been an entire week that I'm pushing, and I can't figure it out, there might be a problem with the project itself. Maybe it's unclear. Maybe I don't have the resources that I need. Maybe it's not aligned with the kind of work that I want to do in this moment. And so that's why I hesitate with being persistent. Be consistent, yes. Try to be consistent, but also inject a bit of flexibility and always practice metacognition so you can make sure that whatever consistency you're building here is adding up to something, to a life that you actually want to live.
That's very powerful. And it's such a nuanced balancing act, which has, once we adopt that, then the compound that produces over the course of our lives is massive. Specifically with our mental health, I think like we push ourselves so hard. I have pushed myself so hard. And then only when like failure comes and really hits me in the face, do I then go like, oh, wow, I've been pushing so hard and just like tunnel vision, go all the time. And it just wasn't healthy. And it's taken me a while to like bounce back from that recently, including like with the podcast and like with creating content. And now I've just adjusted my relationship with it, which I'm really happy about. On the topic of mental health, you have been through lots of journeys yourself. You mentioned you quit smoking, you quit drinking. You mentioned in one of your newsletters that you dug yourself out of a pit in 2023. And you have various methods that you've lent on. Can you speak as to how you have pulled yourself out of deep, dark holes?
Yeah, this is why, and we were talking about it before we started recording, this is why a lot of my work is about addressing that. I think that experience that is very common of people being very successful on the outside and feeling like things are not quite working on the inside, feeling empty, depressed, anxious. I was in that situation for many, many years where things were looking great from the outside, whether I was working at Google or even in the early years of Ness Labs. But actually, I was not doing great when it came to my mental health. I was depressed. I was anxious. I was drinking a lot. I was not sleeping well. And 2023 for me was a pivotal year in the sense that I, for the very first time, felt like I'm actually happy to be here. I'm happy to be alive. I kind of want to stay here for as long as possible and keep on exploring and learning and growing. A big kind of, I would say, like the experience for me that really changed everything and opened that door for me was working with psychedelics. I worked with ayahuasca at the time, which helped me quit drinking. That was a massive part of what was pulling me down when it came to my mental health, because I was using alcohol as a way to numb, avoid my emotions, to always feel like everything is fine. That was basically the way I was feeling all the time. Everything is fine. Never feeling too anxious, never feeling anything too loudly, too strongly. And still being very functional, but not really living. Like, I don't think you can call that a life. You're not really living your life when you're not feeling any of your emotions. And working with psychedelics helped me realize that. Once I opened that door, once I started reconnecting with my emotions, that's when I started to have to build an entire new toolkit for living my life. In the sense that all of a sudden I could feel things. And at the beginning, I wasn't quite sure how to deal with that. So that's why I started journaling, which has become, as we discussed, a big part of how I deal with my thoughts and with my emotions on a daily basis. And movement, we talked about connecting with my body, making sure that all of my processing doesn't happen just at the cognitive level, but also at the physical level. And trying to really make more room for having deep, long conversations with people. I think it's very easy in today's society to feel like you're surrounded with a bunch of people, but you actually never really go deep with them. And everybody is so busy that it's very easy to have those very shallow, quick discussions where it's about, how are you doing? Oh, yeah, I'm busy. Yeah, cool project. I launched this. Awesome. Bye. And you go back home and you actually didn't have in any of that conversation any kind of deep human connection. So another thing I did, with I think is part of my mental health, is hosting dinners, for example, just inviting people to have food together. And it's like 3 or 4 hours or 5 hours sometimes of just having great conversations, sometimes very deep, difficult, vulnerable conversations over food. So those are kind of the tools that I use at the moment. I don't think they're fixed. I think they work really well for me right now. And part of it is, again, always paying attention to how I feel, what works, what doesn't, and always leaving a little bit of space for experimentation.
Which emotions did you find yourself numbing or trying to escape from the most?
Mostly, I would say anxiety, and in particular, time anxiety, this feeling that you're wasting your time and wasting your life, that you're not doing something that matters and that none of it actually matters. It was much easier to just have a couple of drinks and not think about that. So I still have time anxiety now. So
Hi, me again. I know you got a question in your mind. I'd love to hear it in the comments. That's all. All right. Bye.
I want to clarify that it's not about, I didn't go from numbing those emotions to not experiencing them in the first place. I now experience them, but my response is very different. I'm not trying to avoid them. And so time anxiety, for example, for me, manifests in a completely different way. I still sometimes, quite often, think about how short life is, how little time we have on this earth. But now I see it as beautiful. How lucky are we that we get to spend that little time on earth together? And how do I want to spend this time in a way that actually feels alive? Not because I'm scared nobody's going to remember me once I'm dead. Not because I'm worried about what other people are going to think. Not because I feel like I need to be successful and productive for my life to have meaning, but because it is so amazing that I get to be here and to connect with other people and to learn and grow with them, that I want to make the most of it.
Wow. Really powerful. Exactly the message I think I needed to hear at the right time. So I love how the universe works. Michael Singer, also amazing spiritual teacher. I couldn't quite. It took me is taking me a long time to digest the difference between kind of experiencing emotions but not letting them drive us, and how our emotional responses are natural based off of lots of our conditioning, and if we don't experience them, we push them down, then that becomes trauma and tension in our bodies, and it then leads to these big explosions when eventually they do come up. But at the same time, so we want to let the feelings like flow through us, but at the same time, we don't want to let our decisions or reactions often being driven by the emotions. And that part I couldn't get my head around for a while, but Michael Singer was amazing in describing how like we want to let them flow through us freely, as you said, welcoming anxiety into the dinner party, even though it wasn't invited, and then be like, okay, great, thanks for coming. Now it's time for you to go. But yeah, I think this is such a powerful practice, and I haven't related to something deeper as time anxiety in quite a long time. I very sadly lost my dad when I was very young, and a therapist once told me that my subconscious has internalized that life ends at 42, which is when he passed away. And so it's like you need to try and fit in everything you're trying to do within this very short space of time. But reframing it as how can we feel alive in every day? Because trying to, like, previously I've focused on trying to like build things for the sake of significance, and you can spend a decade building something and you can feel significant for a bit, but it's such a external thing, and it's often like very hollow. Or shallow.
And I think, again, this idea of giving ourselves grace for thinking and feeling this way in the first place, whether because you lost a loved one or because you grew up in an environment where there was a certain definition of what it is like to live a meaningful life, and what makes our worth as a human being. Whatever happened in your life, there are lots of reasons why we might respond in this way in the first place. And I think what's very sad sometimes is that we fall into those cycles of self-blame. Why am I doing this? Why do I care so much about success? Why do I care about that? I know I shouldn't care, but I do care. And really the first step is just understanding that as human beings, we are almost like the sum of all of the experience that we had and all of the interactions that we had with other human beings and of our past. And that explains why we respond like that. And there's no need to judge ourselves or blame ourselves. We can just move past it, process it, and then try and see if there's another way of being and way of doing that might feel better.
Where do you still find you judging yourself?
I actually had like a very difficult period of time at the beginning of when the book came out. And my audience all of a sudden went, just to give you a bit of context, about maybe 7 months ago, I had 3,000 followers on Instagram, and I'm almost at 50,000 now. And I know it's not like a big account or whatever, but it's just the trajectory of it. And all of a sudden, I went from having a community of people, an audience that grew with me. My newsletter is quite big, but I've started writing it 5 years ago. And all of the readers on the newsletter, they've seen the journey, they've seen the experimentation, they've seen the mistakes, and they know my work, but they know me as well. And then when the book came out, my work started reaching an entirely new audience that don't really know me. And I was very fortunate to be invited on some very big podcasts, very big YouTube channels. And I made the mistake of reading the comments. And it was my first time ever reading so many negative comments about myself, about my accent, about my appearance, about how I was completely out of touch and privileged, and like a bunch of things, which I, again, at a rational level, I know my life, I know who I am, and I know that's not true. And I also know that I should not care about what people think about my accent or my appearance, right? But again, I'm just a human being, right? And I remember my partner telling me a few months ago, just put your phone down, stop scrolling through these. It was this almost like a really toxic, like self-harm coded kind of behavior of keeping on scrolling and waiting for the next negative comment. And it made me realize that I probably still have a little bit of work to do to figure out, like, to really build true confidence in myself, because I've seen friends, and in particular older friends, that are doing really well when it comes to responding to that kind of feedback, very negative feedback. And I talked about it with them, and they told me, oh, it wasn't always like that. It takes a little bit of practice and experience, and it's a little bit like a muscle that you build, and to try and really teach yourself and your body and your brain that some of this feedback from these people, it really doesn't matter. If it's your partner saying something, yes, or friend, your parent, sure. This random stranger on the internet, it doesn't matter. And although you know this rationally, it will take a bit of practice. So I know this is something that I still need to figure out and to practice. And I'm still sometimes journaling about it when I get that kind of really harsh feedback. So yeah, there's always something you can learn.
Something else to build a tiny experiment around.
Yes.
Well, wow, what a beautiful place to close. This has been absolutely phenomenal. I've loved reading your work. I've loved reading your book. This has been the cherry on the cake, so thank you. The closing tradition is, because you've been so generous with your time, is there anything that an audience of entrepreneurs and builders could support you with?
Well, we've talked about the book. Obviously, get the book. If you like more shorter form content, I write a weekly newsletter at nesslabs.com, where I explore a lot of the ideas we talked about today, but in a shorter format.
I love it. Can you quickly explain why it's called Ness Labs?
Yes. Ness is the suffix that describes the state of being something. So the state of being aware is awareness. You have mindfulness, consciousness. And the newsletter is a space where I explore what it is like to be human.
So powerful. This has been amazing. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, wow. Wow, I love that. Thank you so much for watching. This has been incredible. Thank you for staying to the end. What would be most helpful is if you could share this with a friend of yours. Who would get value from this? Who do you think would enjoy this conversation? It would mean the world to me. I appreciate that you're here. I appreciate you probably already liked, comment, subscribed, all of that stuff. If you haven't, you know what to do. And if you have, then thank you. You're a dream. You make this so much easier for me, and I appreciate it. And so, yeah, share with someone. But otherwise, love you lots. Bye. All right.